For the second session of the day on Postcolonialism and Indian Writing in English, we are delighted to have Professor Bibhash Choudhury from Gauhati University, Assam. And before we invite him for the lecture, may I quickly formally introduce the speaker. Dr. Bibhash Choudhury teaches English in Gauhati University, Assam. He is the author of Reading Postcolonial Theory, Key Texts in Context, which was published by Routledge, English, Social and Cultural History, published in 2005, Beyond Cartography, the Contemporary South Asian Novel in English, published in 2011, and E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, 2013. He has also edited a number of books, including Edward Said and the Politics of Culture, 2008, Amitav Ghosh, Critical Essays, 2009, and Western Mythology, Accounts, Versions, and Tales, which came out in 2014. He'll be speaking to us today on postcolonialism and Indian writing in English. May I now invite Dr. Bibhash Choudhury.
So when I was told about this, postcolonialism and Indian writing in English, so first thing that struck me was how do I plot this? Because as areas, as the two terms go, they converge at certain points, but they are things that can be studied apart. So we can look at postcolonialism without looking at Indian writing in English, or Indian writing in English without referring to postcolonialism. So I thought that let us look at some of the ways in which we can engage with this togetherness that we are trying to negotiate. So I'd like to refer to two writers not associated with either of these two categories. The first is Octavio Paz, the Mexican writer Octavio Paz, and the second is Maria Todorova, a Bulgarian writer who has worked on the Balkans. Now, Octavio Paz wrote a book which has been highly influential in 1965. Subsequently, there were other texts which were added to it, and it came out as The Labyrinth of Solitude. In that book, The Labyrinth of Solitude, Octavio Paz talks about the whole idea of being Mexican, or he looks at the problem of being a Mexican. And he goes on to say that there's a problem with being Mexican is that the Mexicans do not dare or do not want to be Mexican. In that, he's trying to argue that the problem with Mexicans is that they are a very outgoing people when it comes to the whole environment in Mexico, but they are also simultaneously basically very, very solitary. Now, if we take this as a trope of how we look at the question of definition, this is an issue that strikes us to be important when we look at postcolonial studies. And the second reference that I am going to draw outside the field is from the book by Maria Todorova called Imagining the Balkans, which came out in 1996. In that book, in the opening chapter, Todorova made a proposition. In fact, she made a very provocative proposition in the sense that the first chapter, she asked whether Orientalism and Balkanization are two different categories. And she went on to say that when Edward Said was looking at Orientalism as a concept, or he was proposing Orientalism to be one of the important trajectories through which we re-examine our association with the whole idea of the Orient as configured by the West, she argued that that was a view that did not take into account the Orientalist proposition, not by that name, that was going on in Europe itself. The whole idea of Europe hegemonizing thought for the West and then imposing it on the rest of the world is something that forms part of post-colonial studies. So we look at how colonization came about, how colonialism affected our understanding, how history was written or came to be written, and subsequently we look at this whole as a process of questioning or re-examination. We re-examine the relationship between history, memory, and of course our identity. If we take a look at these two broad tropes, one of the act of definition that Octavio Paz talks about, the difficulty of defining a people or defining an individual inside a community. And the second is looking at categories in general terms and how they are subverted by certain questions that emerge from within, such as Orientalism being a blanket term imposed by the West upon the rest of the world, not really effectively working when it comes to the Balkans. From Todorova, if we look at these two tropes and then try to come to the issue at hand, what we know, what we look at when we look at post-colonial theory or post-colonialism, I would like to suggest that one of the problems that we face in this context is that we have multiple, if we refer to India and if we refer to Indian writing, we have multiple specimens of Indian writing, not necessarily of the same kind. And that creates certain difficulties in assessment when you look at post-colonialism as a blanket term and Indian writing in English as a blanket term. The first example that I would like to refer to is a story by a Manipuri writer. It's called The Search. And the story is about a young man called Noah who lives in a village. And the story is by Jim Wangramyong Kasom. That is the name of the writer. The collection where it comes out is Homecoming and Other Stories, published by a publisher called Promila. So in that collection, in the story, The Search, there is this young man, Noah, who lives in a village and who suddenly goes missing. Now, when he goes missing, his parents, his neighbors, the people of the village, they start looking for him. The story then goes on to find Noah. Noah is found. He's sitting on a rock. He's naked, and he's lost. He's brought back home. He's restored. And then he again, after some days, he goes missing. The story tells us about the intervention by some kind of a female figure whose identity is not disclosed. And that female figure is somewhere between the real and the surreal, in that people don't get to see her, but people get to know that he has had encounters with this woman whose identity is not disclosed. Now, when we look at a story like this, where subsequently the examination of Noah by the medical personnel comes to the conclusion that the change of place is necessary. He must be removed from his village in Ukhrul. Ukhrul is a place in Manipur, and he must be taken to some other place so that he is restored, or this influence is minimized. Now, when the story ends, we are left with certain questions. There is a healer in that village whom everyone fears, who is able to talk to the spirits. And she says that this young man, he feels that he comes and tells stories about going to a palace and having the best of food, having the best of luxury, spending time with people there, especially this unidentified woman, and then coming back. But when his body is examined, they see on his hands there are cuts, there are injuries, and it is known that he has been eating worms, he has been eating all these insects, which in his imagination he sees as being the best of food. How are we to read this? Are we to read this as an instance of some kind of a juxtaposition between, in terms of technique? These are questions that would emerge if we are to do a textually engaging analysis. Can we look at it in terms of it being an instance of, say, magic realism from the narrative point of view, where there's a merger of the real and the unreal? Or are we going to look at it sociologically, telling us something about a society where certain conditions, certain beliefs, certain set patterns in society at work, where people believe and subscribe, and there are believers and disbelievers who live in that society? So we have texts like these, which are very much located in real space, in the space within the Indian writing space. On the other hand, if you look at a case like, say, R.K. Narayan's Malgudi, which is an imagined space, which is a space which is imagined, but which is again real in the sense that any new generation reading R.K. Narayan stories, which are located in Malgudi, would say, okay, this is something I know, this is something which I am familiar, this is part of the India I know. So there are these Indias of the imagination, Indias with which we can identify irrespective of where we come from, and there are Indias with which we find it difficult to relate to. So if we are, say, born and brought up in a circumstance which is different from the circumstance of Noah as described in the story by Jim, the story where he goes missing, then how are we to address that? How is the critic in us, or the reader in us, to look at that? Are we going to look at it as a kind of sophisticated storytelling that looks at something exotic, whereas Malgudi is down to earth, located in something which you can identify? Here I would like to refer to an anthropologist, a sociologist, Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas wrote a book, and especially a chapter, I'm going to refer to the chapter, it's called Hotel Kilu. You must have come across this whole idea of Hotel Kilu, is that Mary Douglas, the whole chapter is called Hotel Kilu, where she says that Hotel Kilu is an actual real hotel in Jair, in Africa. So she writes 40 years after she had been to Jair, she goes back to Jair, and she visits that place, Hotel Kilu, and she finds that it is a hotel which seems to be wonderful in terms of its exterior. It looks good, the rooms are good, and she goes there, and when she enters, she is told that she has to make the payment in advance. Why? Because there is no diesel, because her lighting will have to be ensured. There is no water, the water will have to be ensured. And she finds that when she goes to a room, that she finds that there is no electricity, there is no running tap, the lavatory is not working, but there are lights, there are lamps, and of course there is water. She comes back and she wonders about this very, very well-functioning Hotel Kilu, and which appears to be, let's say, an image of a functioning hotel. If you have gone from the West, she says that if I've come from the West, so I may be accused of elitism. But when I go there, when I enter that place, Hotel Kilu, it emerges as a metaphor. And what she writes, I'd just like to read what she writes. She says that this is a metaphor for theory. She says, I describe this inn to you because it strikes me as a rich parable. The truth is that I especially like it for its pretensions. True, none of the modern accoutrements of the hotel functioned, but the hotel actually functioned very well. There were candles for light, the bath had water, the door had a lock. When I look back at all the other overnight stops we made, the Hotel Kilu glimmers in my imagination more and more seductively as the most comfortable, the most secure, and the most light and spacious. The whole thing worked. True, it would only make symbolic gestures towards the normal connection of a hotel to national communities and energy supplies. All buildings lend themselves to metaphor. I take the Hotel Kilu for a metaphor for functionalist theory and for theory in general. Just as the Hotel Kilu is an advantage for a traveler who can use it, so theory is an advantage for thinking. Mary Douglas goes on to call theory a temporary resting place for ideas. The name of the book is Risk and Blame, published by Routledge, 1994. Now, the crucial point for me in this case is how do we make sense of these varieties of Indian writing in English? I'm referring to fiction or poetry. Do we take account of the locations from where they emerge or the locations to which they refer? And in what sense? What would be our theoretical framework and how do we go about it? Do we have a Hotel Kilu? Do we have a functioning theory to account for something like the Search or something like Malgudi? Is the same theory, is the same apparatus, analytical apparatus going to work? If not, how are you going to address that? The second point is the idea of Europe. Now, we know that Europe, if we refer to now classic post-colonial texts like, say, Bibhash Choudhury's Provincializing Europe, or going backwards in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, you have numerous texts which looks at Europe as the other of the Orient. In the Nutmeg's Curse, Amitav Ghosh's latest book, he talks about the situation that we have in the world today. His book, he says, is again a term that I find in Mary Douglas about the term being parable. He talks about this being a parable for our times. Now, if we look at how he configures the idea of Europe in this book, I'll just read out a passage from the Nutmeg's Curse. Even though Gandhi's political arena was India, Amitav Ghosh writes, his thought and his political strategies were nourished by the old and powerful countercurrents that have continued to flow around the planet. Like a subterranean river throughout the time in which the mechanistic metaphysic was rising to dominance. Through the centuries, this current has surfaced again and again in the very heartlands of European modernity, manifesting itself in anti-closure movements, peasant revolts, and sometimes even more stridently vitalist forms of protest, such as those associated with the diggers, ranters, and levelers of the 17th century. Close quote. Now, if you look at this situation where Europe being the center of Western thought, or Europe being the metaphor of so-called civilization, which postcolonialism tries to question or ask questions about, Amitav Ghosh is trying to look at the situation that we have today in terms of how we think, how we orient our thought, how we connect to what is going on in terms of what he calls powerful countercurrents. This takes us back to Europe. So today, we are not thinking of the West and the other, or Orient and the Western other, as distinctive categories, but we're looking at these spaces, or these spaces as those critical platforms where there are intersections which compel us to look at these issues in greater detail. So the categories or concepts that we have been using in postcolonial studies conventionally, say a concept like the other or othering that we use in postcolonial studies, we use that or refer to that almost naturally by now. We have different forms of othering. We have different thinkers that we associate with the other. We have the Levinasian other, we have the Hegelian other, we have the other of Foucault, we have the other of Said. So but then the other is there as a constant. So what I find very interesting now is that these constants of postcolonial theory are being opened up for greater scrutiny. And that scrutiny is happening not because someone has brought in an apparatus and say, okay, now let's dismantle what's going on, but because of the writing, because of the kind of writing that we have seen emerge in recent years. So if we look at Amitav Ghosh as an Indian writer who writes in English, and if we look at his writing, and if we look at his writing as, say, through certain structures, we could say Amitav Ghosh is an anthropologist who writes in English. We have certain claims being made, such as I recently met one of my colleagues in the airport some days back. He had the great derangement in his hand, and I asked him, "You're a man of history, you're reading Amitav Ghosh?" He says, "No, he writes, his books carry great research." So are we looking at Amitav Ghosh as someone whose writing gives us the evidence of sustained research which is reflected in his writing, or are we going to employ the same thought apparatus, critical apparatus, in looking at Amitav Ghosh and someone like R.K. Narayan, who looks at a space which he conjures up from his imagination but reflects what we call the India we know. In 1996, there was another book which was published. 1996, Maria Todorova published this book, Imagining the Balkans. 1996, Raja Rao published, that's of course very late towards his writing career, called The Meaning of India. It was published by Hind Pocket Books, and subsequently in 2020, Penguin Modern Classics reprinted that, The Meaning of India. And in The Meaning of India, Raja Rao gives us an interesting insight about a conversation that took place between Malraux, the French writer, and Jawaharlal Nehru. And he was writing about this incident which took place in the very early part of the 20th century. So during this conversation, Nehru was telling Malraux about European civilization and how Europe had such wonderful currents of thought, and Europe had its heritage, Europe had its civilization, to which Malraux responded. And this is a meeting where Raja Rao was present, so he recounts, this is what Raja Rao writes about Malraux telling Jawaharlal Nehru. This is around 1935. So I quote Raja Rao, "Malraux became polite and explained himself. Europe is destructive, suicidal. Europe, as Nietzsche understood, and who understood Europe better than Nietzsche did. So he had to go mad. You remember what Dostoevsky said, Europe is a symmetry of ideas. Yes, we cannot go beyond good and evil. We can never go, as Indians can, beyond duality. India had Shankara, France had Descartes, Aristotle made a mess of Europe, he created good and evil." End quote. So this is apparently, for us, an European telling that Europe is no good. Now, this is also Indian writing in English. This is Raja Rao writing about India in the eyes of the West. Then we have a very interesting book, which we have all read. I'm sure you have read this many a time, but I'm going to again, just for the sake of contrast, refer to this. It is in a chapter called Adventures of a Brown Man in Search of Civilization. This is from the book A Passage to England by Bibhash Choudhury, published in 1910. Again, I quote, I want to show you the contrast. During my stay in the West, short as it was, I met a situation that very much surprised me. For what I could not see there was today's Europe of our conception. It is the Europe on which the Public Service Commission in India sets the stiffest imaginable questions, and to which, therefore, before the examination or interview, some of our acutest young brains devote some weeks of hectic cramming. This is also the Europe in which our intellectuals are interested to the exclusion of everything else. Without putting too fine a point on this Europe may be defined as the Europe of politico-economic tribe, end quote. So, as readers of Indian writing in English, to read a book like this, A Passage to England, 1910, Raja Rao, The Meaning of India, 1996, Amitabh Ghosh, The Nutmeg's Curse, published last year. We have, therefore, varying points of argument through which these constants, India, the other, and of course, joining them together is Europe. These constants emerging very differently, depending on the position one takes. And as you can see in these three cases, Bibhash Choudhury, Raja Rao, and Amitabh Ghosh, they happen to be presented to us as personal points of view. That means Bibhash Choudhury is writing as someone who has experience, who knows that this is what the civil services ask, but this is not the Europe I have encountered. Raja Rao gives an account where he is the eyewitness, he is present, and he says this is the Europe and this is the India in the eyes of the outsider, so the other. And Amitabh Ghosh says that Gandhi, or someone like Gandhi, was, of course, traveling through his ideas, not only in India, outside of India, and bring that in, drawing it in. So the flow of ideas, to refer to Edward Said's traveling theory, is something that is not territory bound. It is something that keeps circulating. Now, the question before us is, as readers of Indian writing in English, when we say address this question of how do we make use of these constants when we are reading a text? Because the text before us will come with their own trajectories through which they will underpin certain issues, look at certain themes, and those themes may relate to what we would be referring to as the other. So in the story called The Search, for Noah, society is the other. This is not the place where he is comfortable in. He is comfortable in that world to which he disappears. For the people of that village, for the community in Ukhrul, the world he disappears to is the other. For someone who is accustomed to reading R.K. Narayan, or say Kanthapura, this is the other. This is the other writing that takes place. Now, there's another interesting point being made in an essay called The Subaltern and the Miner, which was published in 2022 in a journal called Critical Times by Ajay Skaria. Critical Times, 2022, July. the exact volume number I don't recall. Ajay Skaria, Skaria, and the title of the essay is The Subaltern and the Miner. Now, in that essay, Skaria talks about what is the miner. And he tries to make an argument which I find interesting for the kind of plot I'm developing here, is that he says that the subaltern, in order to make its impact, must remain subaltern, not in the way it is perceived, but in the way it can make an impact. So he extends the idea of the subaltern to enhance the power of the miner. And he says the subaltern is that force which is effective because it is minor. Now, this idea where the force of a marginalized voice or a marginalized people becomes effective because it is distinctively different is also connected to one of the issues in postcolonial theory that we know by the term resistance. Because postcolonial theory is, let's say, we can argue, is a form of resistance to the conventional historiographic model through which our pasts are made and remembered. So let's say if postcolonialism seeks to revise our understanding of the past, of our understanding of how memories are constructed, then the impact of postcolonialism comes because it brings to the fore or foregrounds those resistant voices that emerge from within that narrative and propose an alternative reading of the past. We have numerous models like this which are not within postcolonialism. In 1985, Alan Sinfield and Jonathan Dollimore published a book called Political Shakespeares. And in that book, we find the argument about cultural materialism is called Essays in Cultural Materialism, Political Shakespeare. And Alan Sinfield makes an argument, not only in that book, elsewhere also, about what he calls the fault lines in culture. He gives the example of Othello, and Othello deriving his force from what is seen as weakness by the community, because he's the outsider, he's the other, he's the black, he's the non-us. And in many ways, the whole idea of this non-us is something that becomes part of the narrative that we make or seek to make when we look at postcolonialism as a process of understanding the past. The other example that I would like to refer to from outside postcolonial theory comes from an essay by Jacques Derrida. Derrida wrote an essay called On Forgiveness. Now, if we read this essay, it of course never strikes us as being a possible site where he would have to talk something about colonialism. It's on forgiveness, on the philosophical process through which he examines the concept of forgiveness. He says forgiveness is the forgiveness of the unforgivable. What is forgiveness if you can forgive the forgivable? It's like someone coming and saying sorry. They say, oh, it's fine. That's not forgiveness for Derrida. In that essay, after examining the situation in South Africa by looking at the Truth Commission and the problems faced by the Truth Commission in South Africa. Derrida talks about this. I'll give this quotation from Jacques Derrida on forgiveness. I quote, "All nation states are born and found themselves in violence. I believe that truth to be irrecusable. Without even exhibiting atrocious spectacles on this subject, it suffices to underline a law of structure, the moment of foundation. The instituting moment is anterior to the law of legitimacy which it founds. Before the modern forms of what is called, in the strict sense, colonialism, all states have their origin in an aggression of the colonial type." So Derrida argues that the making of a state is an exercise in colonialization. It's a form of power being exercised over the other. So irrespective of that state really being colonized by a power, he says any state being created, any state coming into being is a result of colonialism. So if we are looking at concepts like these that extend the limits of these terms outside the history or space of colonial experience, he's not referring to any colonized state or any colonized situation. He's referring to something that is conceptually to be seen in terms of the making of a state. When a state is made, it is an exercise of colonialism. That's his argument. Now, if we look at this, if we look at something like this where the very exercise of colonialism is about distinction, is about making of categories, how are we to look at the situation we have in front of us? I'd like to refer to two poems. Now, the first poem that I'd like to refer to is by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. It's called "To an Unborn Daughter." It's a short poem. I'll read out the poem. It's pretty short. Look at the title, "To an Unborn Daughter." I quote, "If writing a poem could bring you into existence, I'd write one now, filling the stanzas with more skin and tissue than a body needs, filling the lines with speech. I'd give you your mother's close-bitten nails and light brown eyes, for I think she had them. I saw her only once through a train window in a yellow field. She was wearing a pale-colored dress. It was cold. I think she wanted to say something." This is the end of the poem. Now, it brings to us a lot of images. "To an Unborn Daughter" is, of course, an imagined entity, but he is drawing attention to the mother, who could have been the mother, is someone he sees as he's traveling by train. So he sees a woman who could have, if things moved, and he doesn't know her. It's just like the solitary reaper. He has no idea about who the woman is, who could have been a mother. And so it is a completely imaginary situation through which he is drawing in many of these tropes that I've been referring to: the subaltern and the minor, the voiceless, the point of resistance coming but not happening, and writing as that force which can make us realize of these existences which otherwise would go unrecorded. So Indian writing in English, for instance, in this case, if we go back to the story that I referred to the church, that it tells us of something which otherwise would have gone unrecorded. So recording, chronicling, documentation, through imagination and through the process of writing is crucial. It's crucial not only for Indian writing in English, but also crucial for postcolonialism, because it then serves to intervene in that space which enables us to have a dialogue with societies, with realities that may not be part of where we stand or how we look at the world. So in a way, this dialogue is facilitated by both, by what we call postcolonial theory and by what we are now referring to as a body of writing which is written in English and which has the whole enterprise being connected to India. Now, there's another poem which is written by Keki Daruwala. It's called Gulzaman's Son. I think you have all read the poem, so I won't refer to the text. Now, I see this as an interesting facet of Indian writing in English, and I would call it character studies. Indian writing in English is somehow, it has created this body where we have different character studies. Now, the characters can be something like what Amitav Ghosh does in The Nutmeg's Curse. He creates this whole character of this island and brings to us a history, a reality, a trajectory, which is not something that was outside the space of history making, but then it comes to us because he has brought it straight in our face and says, see, look at this is how things have been going on. Or the unborn daughter, or Gulzaman, or the character of Noah, or Swami in Malgudi. These character studies are both, I would say, strength and forte of Indian writing in English, but also, to me, a point of weakness. We have all the major tropes that we find in literature emerging in Indian writing in English. We have stories about death, about love, about violence, about family, about society, about crisis, about future. But if we are to look at this and place, say, Indian writing as a body of work, and say place it beside some of the vernacular literatures that we have in India, do we find something missing? Do we find that, okay, this has not been attended to? We can have arguments on both sides. We can say, no, this is a different body of work, it is a different orientation, it emerges in a different language, the repository is different. On the other hand, we could say that this whole idea of culture mapping that takes place, that we map culture through a body of work, through a body of writing, through a tradition that now has become very consolidated. In this, how do we make this relationship? How do we see the gaps in Indian writing in English? I think one of the priorities that we can look at as students of literature, students of Indian writing in English, and engaging with postcolonial theory is to see how distinctive Indian writing in English has become because of the path it has taken or the path it has not chosen to take. We can have a lot of, as Amitav Ghosh uses the term, countercurrents being drawn into it, and we can say, okay, this is something which Indian writing in English is not equipped to address. One of the issues which I'm going to look at when I'm going to discuss the text we have today is related to what can be called the cultural matrices that somehow do not lend themselves or cannot be accommodated seamlessly in what we call the field of Indian writing. Is that an issue? Is that something that needs to be negotiated? A point that was made in the preface of Kanthapura by Raja Rao, is that a point that we think to be relevant even today? Do we need to look at a particular kind of writing for it to be effectively representative of the culture it tries to make its subject? Now, I'd like to leave with two questions for you. How far is the limit of Indian writing in English going to? Let's say if we look at it as one universe, so what is the outer limit of Indian writing in English? We know that today we have an extensive, if we go by the network, if we go by the popularity index, an extensive body of work by writers who are not quite writers in the way we would situate the writers I have mentioned. They are on the bestseller lists, they are celebrities, they sell beyond the imagination of the writers we have mentioned. No one would really take up a Mehrotra or a Jusawala text as someone would go and gobble up these writers and texts. So they are also writing in English. They are writing for an Indian audience, and they are writing for readers who think these are the writers that matter. Adil Jusawala wrote a very short essay on Vole Soinka. In that essay, Jusawala talks about his experience of meeting Vole Soinka in England. And Jusawala says that Vole Soinka was, at that point of time when he met, and I think that's true even today, was a street fighter, in the sense that he would fight, and he in fact walked out of a lecture, or he would walk out of a classroom if he did not find that something that he considered tenable in terms of argument. And Jusawala says, in the context of what Vole Soinka wrote and practiced, Jusawala says, our writing seems, he used the word called prattle. He says, we are doing rubbish. So, is Indian writing in English required to be socially relevant? Is that one of the issues? Is ideology important for this body of work to be seen as important by people who are outside this body of work? So someone who is reading Indian writing in English, but who has not to do with this culture or this society. Just as someone say, we are reading, if we are looking at Octavio Paz, we are not Latin Americans in that sense, so we are looking at Octavio Paz and saying, okay, this is what we have of Latin American culture. So if someone who is, say, someone from Latin America were to read Indian writing in English, so are we expecting them to look at that body of work which focuses on something which is socially and ideologically relevant, or what Jusawala talks of himself as writing prattle, or are we going to leave what, I'll take a risk and say, what is available and what is prattle to be taken as, or appearing in the same bookshelf as Amitav Ghosh? Will we take that to be representative of Indian writing English, even though we have not yet chosen to chronicle them? Is that something that we need to address? Do we need to write on such work, or should we ignore them? Can we ignore them even though they are very much present everywhere in our digital space, in our bookshelves, and of course, in the publishers' lists? So I leave with that. Thank you so much.